This is Roman, and I'm looking at the updated March numbers for the Russian budget. Last month's video looked at why you don't want to look at the cumulative figures. You want to break out the budget numbers by month to see what is happening on a month-to-month basis. And we also looked at the concept of seasonality, why you don't want to compare to the previous month so much as the same month at the previous year, and why you want to and now why that helps you identify some patterns that might otherwise be missing. And once again, the reason why we really want to pay attention to the Russian budget numbers is without the money to pursue their genocidal war against Ukraine, they will have a very hard time keeping the war effort going. So it's very important to understand what is happening with the Russian budget, where the money is coming from, and if there are any trouble on the horizon for them. So let's get started. This is the headlines that we're seeing in the papers talking about where the budget currently stands at the end of March. And we're seeing a 29 billion first quarter budget deficit, which, on the surface looks great. If you look further into the article, it'll explain that the month actually had a surplus. So let's see what's going on. I am going to navigate to my handy dandy dashboard, and we're going to look at the monthly budget balance converted to dollars. And I have made an adjustment to that. The conversion rate we had been using was 74 rubles to a dollar. For the last month, it's 77 rubles to a dollar. And that's because the value of the ruble has been dropping, and we want to adjust for that. So looking at our chart, we can see the big deficit we've talked about for December of 2022, a massive $54 billion, not ruble, $54 billion deficit in December, which was, then we had a monthly deficit of $23 billion in January, $11 billion in February, so that was that 35 billion combined deficit, 34 billion, excuse me. But in March, we see that there's a $3.7 billion surplus. So things are looking up for the Russian budget, it would seem. So let's now look at the seasonal factors and the components of the budget and the expenditures and see what that tells us, why the change. All right, so we already have it here broken out by the seasonal components. We're basically looking at the first quarter, comparing the years 2021 to 2022 to 2023. And some patterns begin to emerge. First of all, it looks like March is always a very strong month for the non-oil revenue. We've seen that in 2022, we've seen it in 2021, and we're seeing the pattern stay consistent. But what we can see as well compared to prior years is that the oil and gas revenue, which remember for Russia is a big source of revenue, looks a lot smaller in 2023 compared to 2022. You're going from $16 billion in revenue to $8 billion in revenue. Apologies, I got interrupted. This is not a professional recording studio. In any case, as I was saying, there is a big drop in oil and gas revenue in 2023 compared to 2022 and even 2021, which I'll remind you, well, it's actually about the same as 2021, which I'll remind you was a pandemic year. So we can see the revenues are significantly lower in that year compared to 2022. So it's an interesting pattern because you would think that under all those sanctions, you would see a drop in non-oil revenue as well, but currently we're not seeing it, and I think we can look into the reasons for that a little bit later. Lastly, we want to compare the same seasonal patterns for revenues versus expenses. So we are seeing in the last 3 months that the expenses have actually been going down for Russian budget, which is interesting because you would think that with a war happening, there would be a consistent need for additional expenses, just salaries for your servicemen, fuel, equipment, etc., etc. However, right now it looks like there has been a drop in those expenditures, and that, and combined with increasing expenses represented by the blue line, increased revenue represented by the blue line, what you are seeing is a surplus because right now the revenues exceed the expenses. So, that's where that is coming from. And one last thing we wanted to look at for Russian budget data is this new chart I put together, which looks at oil and gas as percent of total revenue. And I think you could kind of see it in the earlier representations, but here you can, it's really kind of spelled out. So what this tells you, what percentage of the total revenue comes from oil and gas revenues. And what we're seeing here is at the beginning of 2022, when the oil and gas prices spiked and people were loading up on supplies for the coming winter before there was a complete block of Russian energy supplies, we saw big percentage of total revenue coming from oil and gas, and that carried on through about October, November of 2022. So, and the range seems to be between 35 and 45%, with April 22 being a huge outlier. That's when 1 barrel of gas was $115. So that was obviously a very good month for the Russian budget. And we can see even going back to 2021, it still made up somewhere between, on average, between 30 and 45%. But what we're seeing now is it's ever since the price cap and embargo went in December of 2022, it has been steady at 30% and or declining. So March saw the smallest percentage of total revenue coming from oil and gas at 27% that we've seen in basically 2 years. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's what we're seeing in the Russian budget figures. But we know that March was an eventful month. We had the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. There was a lot of instability and concern about what's happening with the Western banking system. So let's see how that played out in our data. So let's take a look first of all at the Urals oil price per barrel. And as we can see, let me just scroll down a little bit. The beginning of March, the Urals oil per barrel was at the $60 mark. Then it crashed corresponding with that bank run of sorts and with that instability. And it was in the low 50s. And when that stabilized and when OPEC promised their oil cuts, we saw this increase back into the 60s. So in April, it looks like Russian oil is selling for somewhere over $60 per barrel, which is interesting considering there's supposedly a cap at $60 per barrel. So that's something really worth keeping an eye on. So April might be a good month for Russia, or at least a better month than the last couple months for Russian oil revenue. What about the non-oil revenue? Well, Janis Kluge, who is a German economist who keeps an eye on the Russian economy and probably understands it way better than I do, has a very interesting thread looking at the Russian March budget. And what I would specifically focus on, and here he identifies the surplus compared to the deficit of the prior months. But what I found very interesting, and this is also very interesting in terms of expenditures. You can kind of see the downward pattern happening in the year 2023, which is kind of inconsistent with prior years where expenditures tended to go up. But this graph I find very interesting, and it shows the seasonality of Russian non-oil revenue. And you can kind of see that historically, at least in the last year, you would see the non-oil revenue increase from January through March, then drop in April, increase a little bit through June, drop in July, increase a little bit in September, increase a little bit from July to September, and so forth. You can kind of see the pattern, right? And in 2023, the pattern stayed the same. He talks about change in their VAT withholdings. I tried to find some information online. It didn't really come through anywhere. So I think in the next video it might be interesting to look at what is happening with the Russian non-oil revenue. There's been some articles about foreign companies having to deposit 10% of their sales when they're trying to exit the market and sell all their holdings. There's been talk about additional windfall taxes on Russian businesses. So I think there's quite a bit happening in the background that might be an interesting topic of research going forward. But I just kind of want to flag this because it looks like we might expect a pretty significant drop in non-oil revenue in April, May, and June compared to the first 3 months of the year. And depending on how the expenses look, we might see a return of deficits for the Russian budget. Of course, these are all official Russian budget numbers. And again, we should always take those with a grain of salt, but it's the best we have. And it's probably useful as an upper bound of how the Russian budget actually looks. But yeah, Yanis Kluge, he had an excellent thread that's worth investigating. So I will add that link in the description. I'll add the link to the last month's video in the description. So take a look. And once again, all feedback is welcome. I'm doing this in my own free time just because I think this is a very interesting subject. And we'll keep it going as long as it makes sense. Thank you, and thanks for watching.